A passenger kicked near a family's pet mid-flight, but he had no idea the father was a retired sniper, and the cabin held its breath. A passenger kicked a cat near the baby, thinking no one would notice. He didn't realize the father standing nearby was a retired sniper, trained to react with precision and unstoppable speed. The moment the animal yelped, the cabin's balance of power shifted. Subscribe. If you believe, arrogance collapses instantly when real authority awakens. The boot tapped once, then again, a steady, almost rhythmic pulse against the cabin floor. Darius Rennick noticed it the same way he noticed everything, without looking like he was watching. Row 17, aisle seat, left side. Passenger was tall, broad across the shoulders with a restlessness that didn't match the gentle taxi of the aircraft. His posture was wrong, not nervous, not bored, intentional, like he was waiting to act. Darius didn't shift in his seat. Instead, he lowered his voice and said, "Almost there, Rowan," as he gently cradled the infant in his right arm. The small travel carrier rested against his left knee, and from its mesh window peeked two amber eyes, wide with curiosity. Brisker, the ginger cat, pressed his nose to the mesh, whiskers twitching as if sensing more than just cabin air. Across the aisle, the boot tapped a third time. A few rows behind, the flight attendant, Marin Jarris, lingered too long at his post-check sweep. He paused near the tapping boot. His hand hovered briefly near the overhead latch before he turned away, not opening it. Something had caught his attention, but like Darius, Marin didn't want to draw focus. The plane continued its taxi, soft growl beneath the floor, and above them the cabin lights dimmed to a warm twilight. Safety, or the illusion of it. Darius leaned slightly, as though adjusting the bottle tucked into Rowan's blanket wrap, but his eyes flicked across the cabin in sharp intervals. Emergency exits, 3 within reach. Average passenger weight distribution, heavier on the left side of the fuselage. Crew-to-passenger ratio, underpowered. Civilian reactions in a threat event, unpredictable, usually paralyzed. The math wasn't in their favor. It rarely was. Rowan cooed quietly, drawing a brief smile from a man across the aisle, one of the few who had smiled since boarding. Most hadn't even noticed Darius carry the child on board. Fewer noticed the cat, but one man had. The man with the tapping boot, Keldrick Vaughn. Darius didn't know the name yet, but he knew the type. The kind of man who had already decided something didn't belong, long before anyone had spoken. The kind of man who sat with tension wired behind his spine, not because he was anxious, but because he was searching for a target to justify his mood. The way he occasionally glanced sideways at the carrier, then upward with disdain, confirmed it. Darius didn't like that glance. He checked Brisker's position again. The cat hadn't made a sound, but his tail had curled inward, his body tucked low inside the carrier like prey. Not fear, caution. Darius had watched that posture dozens of times before. It was the same one he'd seen on night patrols in the borderlands, when wild jackals sensed motion in brush. Across the cabin, the tapping stopped. Marin returned up the aisle, slowing once more beside the same seat. He didn't look at the passenger this time, but his walk faltered. He was trained for hospitality, not confrontation. Yet even he felt the wrongness coiling in the atmosphere. The flight hadn't even left the tarmac, and already the air felt too tight. "Should be about an hour and 45 minutes to Merrow," Marin announced to the row in general, his voice steady. "We'll begin beverage service shortly after takeoff." The man with the boot tapping didn't respond. Instead, he exhaled, sharp, theatrical, and turned his head just slightly toward the sound of Rowan's breathing. Darius caught it. That small shift. The way a predator marks motion, not volume. That was not a man annoyed by noise. That was a man offended by presence. It wasn't just Brisker that bothered him. It was Rowan. Darius's jaw tensed, but his face remained still. He whispered again, "We'll be okay." more for himself than for the child. The engines roared as the aircraft gained speed. Outside, the lights of the terminal blurred into streaks. Inside, oxygen pressure increased as the aircraft lifted. Rowan shifted lightly against Darius's chest. The baby's small fist curled near the zipper of his father's jacket. Brisker remained still, eyes unblinking now. As the plane broke cloud cover, a rare moment of hush fell across the cabin. Seatbelt signs blinked overhead. Marin made his round again, this time noting Darius's secure hold of both child and carrier. He gave a small nod of approval. Reassurance passed silently between two men who understood procedure. But Marin paused again 2 rows back, this time stealing a glance at the manifest list on his tablet. Keldrick hadn't made a sound, but he hadn't blinked either. The false peace thickened. It tricked most of the cabin into softening, relaxing shoulders, powering on devices, closing tray tables with a click. But for Darius, it signaled only one thing. False quiet never lasts. Not on planes, not in war zones, not when men like that were too quiet for too long. The boot tapped again, just once. Then silence. Darius inhaled slowly and checked the reflection on the cabin window beside him. Keldrick's posture was straighter now. His hands were on his knees, fingers spread. A deliberate position. His chin tilted slightly downward, just enough to conceal the mouth, but not the eyes. And those eyes were locked, not on Darius, but on the mesh carrier at his feet. Brisker's ears flattened. The foreshadowing was now loud. Not to everyone, but to those who'd seen combat dressed in peacetime clothing. Darius gave no outward reaction, but inside the equation was changing. His objective had been simple. Complete the flight to Marrow City without incident, make it to the pediatric consult, and ensure Rowan's surgery plan stayed on schedule. He didn't want to relive any part of his old life, didn't want to use his skills, his precision, his training. That life was buried. He was a father now. But mission shifts never came with warnings. He looked down at Rowan, then at Brisker, then at the man whose foot tapped like a coded message into the floor. This was the moment Darius felt the mission was shifting, even though nothing had happened yet. The moment Brisker let out a soft meow, the atmosphere shifted. Rowan giggled quietly, delighted by the sound. His tiny fingers reached toward the carrier, his bright eyes full of innocent joy. A few nearby passengers smiled at the wholesome interaction, the kind that softened the stress of air travel. But across the aisle, Keldrick Vaughn's head snapped sideways like a spring-loaded trap. His nostrils flared. "Animals on planes," he muttered, the words sharp and contemptuous, barely above a whisper, but loud enough for Marin Jarrus, the passing flight attendant, to catch. Marin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes cut toward Keldrick with a flicker of unease, but he kept walking, the way a man does when he's seen a spark but hopes there's no fuel nearby. Darius noticed the hesitation. He didn't know what Keldrick had said, but he recognized the kind of reaction it caused. It was the kind you learn to watch for in high-risk zones, when someone senses an unstable element but doesn't yet know whether to engage or wait. Keldrick shifted in his seat, one leg bouncing anxiously beneath his tray table. It wasn't idle restlessness. Darius had seen that rhythm before, in interrogation rooms, and worse. It was a prelude to action, even if the person didn't yet know what they were about to do. Darius leaned slightly forward, pretending to adjust Rowan's blanket, while his mind scanned the cabin again. 3 exits, 2 lavatories, 1 drink cart stuck near row 16. The seatbelt sign remained lit, though the turbulence had passed. Darius catalogued it all in seconds, then returned his gaze casually to Keldrick, who was now stretching his foot unnaturally far into the aisle. Marin approached from the other side, maneuvering around the cart with practiced ease. As he passed Keldrick, the man didn't budge. His boot stayed in the aisle like a snare. At the last second, Marin had to pivot awkwardly, nearly colliding with the cart behind him. He turned back with a tight jaw and muttered, "Please keep your feet clear of the aisle, sir." Keldrick didn't move. Instead, he leaned his elbow on the armrest, resting his chin on his knuckles, and smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a man who enjoyed watching people flinch. Darius caught the entire exchange. No words were needed. That look, the deliberate extension of dominance followed by a grin, told him exactly what kind of man Keldrick was. Not just impatient, not just annoyed, but the kind who tested others for weakness just to see who'd fold. Rowan shifted in Darius's lap as if sensing the shift in energy. Brisker's ears perked again. The ginger cat's calm earlier curiosity had vanished, replaced by a low, tense alertness. Darius gently stroked the top of the carrier without looking down, letting Brisker know he was aware. There was something else Darius had noticed. Marin. The attendant was now moving faster, more clipped in his motions. Each time he walked past Keldrick's row, his shoulders tensed. He never lingered, never made eye contact. That wasn't just a reaction to a rude passenger, it was a reaction to someone who had already shown signs of instability. What Darius didn't know, what the airline had failed to share, was that before the flight departed, Marin had been quietly told that Keldrick Vaughn had caused 2 incidents earlier that day. At Halden Terminal 4, he'd shouted at a gate agent for delaying boarding over a child's stroller. At the connecting terminal, he'd argued violently with another passenger over emotional support animals. The man had a record, not criminal, but behavioral, enough to warrant a discreet watch. Yet somehow they'd let him on board anyway. Now, in row 17C, he was 3 feet from Darius and his son, and he was watching them. Darius tightened his grip slightly around Rowan, not enough to alarm the child, just enough to adjust his posture in a way that allowed faster reaction time. His mind wasn't racing. It was tracking. Every movement, every breath from Keldrick's direction. He replayed the last few minutes. The foot in the aisle. The muttered complaint. The forced reaction from Marin. And now. That grin. It wasn't a random pattern. It was escalating. The problem was, Darius still didn't know what the trigger would be. Would it be another meow? Rowan's cry? Something as minor as a sneeze? There was always a chance the pressure might release on its own. That maybe the presence of other passengers, the visibility, the formality of flight, would keep Keldrick restrained. But Darius had learned a hard truth long ago. Some men didn't need a reason to break. They just needed a crack in the moment. And this cabin was filled with them. Uncertain crew, passive passengers, and a man with a baby and a cat who would be easy to blame if things went wrong. Darius exhaled through his nose and adjusted his seatbelt. He could feel the tension in his shoulders. Not fear, but readiness. The kind that settled into your spine like a coiled spring. Stillness before action. Across the aisle, Keldrick tapped his fingers against his knee, then stopped, then smiled again. Darius didn't move. The air felt heavier now, like the cabin itself was bracing. Most of the passengers had gone back to their distractions, headphones, tablets, half-hearted naps, but there were always a few who watched. A young man with glasses across the row, chewing his lip. A middle-aged man 2 seats down gripping his armrest every time Keldrick shifted. None of them knew what they were watching, but they all felt it. The unseen edge. Meanwhile, Keldrick leaned back, staring not at Darius but at the cat carrier, eyes narrowing with silent disdain. His lip twitched, barely, almost like he was daring Brisker to make another sound. Darius didn't speak. He didn't shift. He simply waited, because he knew this wasn't over, not even close. The air felt tight, as though the plane itself sensed something was coming. Rowan began to fuss softly. Darius shifted his weight just enough to rock the child, the slow rhythm of movement more methodical than soothing. His whisper was low, nearly inaudible. "You're all right, little man. Just a little longer." Rowan's head turned instinctively toward the sound of his father's voice, settling slightly. But as the carrier at Darius's feet shifted during the motion, the ginger cat inside stirred. Brisker's triangular ears twitched first, then his head poked up, eyes wide and whiskers twitching as if trying to assess the unfamiliar altitude and ambient stress. A soft meow escaped him, thin but audible. That was all it took. Keldric Vaughn's head snapped toward them, his expression folding instantly into a scowl. He leaned out into the aisle with a suddenness that made the man beside him flinch. "Animals and babies don't belong on flights," he muttered loudly, just enough to be heard across several rows. His voice held the bitter edge of someone looking for agreement, but instead, a quiet unease spread among the passengers. A few heads turned toward Darius, some offering faint smiles of sympathy, others clearly debating whether to pretend they hadn't heard anything at all. No one responded aloud. Darius didn't move. His face remained impassive, but his mind accelerated. The insult wasn't just rudeness. It was calculated volume, loud enough for public pressure, quiet enough for plausible deniability. Darius had encountered that tone in other arenas. War zones, interrogation rooms, border standoffs. It belonged to men who instigated slowly, testing for weakness before pouncing. Marin Jarrus returned up the aisle, his stride clipped and formal, but his eyes flicked sharply toward Keldric. Without hesitation, he offered a pair of noise-reduction earbuds, presenting them like a peace offering. "No, thank you," Keldric growled, brushing Marin's hand away with enough force to make the gesture feel hostile. "I shouldn't have to drown out crying and scratching to enjoy a seat I paid for." Brisker gave another meow, slightly louder this time, sensing the emotional charge in the air. Keldric slapped the side of his own seat with the flat of his palm. The sharp sound startled several passengers. The man across the aisle flinched visibly, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. Still, Darius didn't react. He was analyzing, calculating, tracking Keldric's behavior not as a series of isolated outbursts but as escalating stages of instability. This wasn't just an angry man. This was someone methodically moving up a scale of confrontation, possibly with a goal in mind. From the row opposite, a thin-shouldered man, Trevin Halcor, turned slightly toward his seatmate and whispered, "Should we say something?" His voice trembled. His partner, a quiet man in a brown windbreaker, shook his head subtly and looked forward again. Fear triumphed over conscience. The tension now settled across the cabin like a thick fog, unspoken yet unmistakable. Rowan whimpered again, and Darius held him tighter. His heart rate did not increase. His breath remained even, but every sensory input in his body was now aligned toward one task: prediction. Keldric wasn't done, not by a long stretch. "Please return to your seats," Marin said to no one in particular as he moved further up the aisle, but his tone was clipped, not commanding. He wasn't in control anymore. He was managing chaos with borrowed time. Keldric leaned forward, craning his neck for a better view of the carrier on the floor. His gaze lingered not on the baby, but on the cat. It was not annoyance in his eyes now. It was obsession. His jaw tensed. His nostrils flared slightly as if remembering a smell that triggered some private, irrational grudge. Darius had seen that expression before, in operatives reliving trauma, in detainees planning rash acts of defiance, in commanders moments before breaching orders. Brisker lowered his head but did not retreat fully. His eyes stayed fixed on Keldric, ears angled in hyper-attentive alert. Darius noted it. The animal wasn't just scared, it was reading the threat, too. That meant something was about to happen. The man's left foot shifted, slowly drawing back beneath the seat as though coiling tension. Not overtly, but enough for someone trained in pre-conflict body language to detect. Rowan let out a sharp cry and began to squirm again. Darius glanced down and gently adjusted the blanket around his son, one hand still loosely around the carrier handle. Behind him, a flight attendant called for assistance on the intercom. Someone had likely flagged Marin, but it would take a few more minutes for help to reach them. Darius's gaze flicked from Keldrick's foot to his eyes, then back to the aisle. Distance, 2.5 feet. Angle of approach, too narrow for a kick without shifting weight forward. Timing, unstable. Motivation, unclear but escalating. Keldrick's fingers tapped against his armrest rhythmically now, not in nervousness but in something more deliberate, like counting down. Darius shifted his grip on Rowan so his right arm could move freely if needed, not as a threat, but as a safeguard. His body blocked direct access to his son. He repositioned the carrier subtly. The man across the aisle, Trevin, glanced over again, this time not at the cat, but at Darius. Something about the stillness in the father's expression unnerved him more than Keldrick's anger. "Is he okay?" Trevin whispered, nodding toward Keldrick. "No," Darius said simply. The moment stretched. Then Marin walked back down the aisle to speak with another attendant, and Keldrick took the opportunity to lean forward again, closer, too close, fixated on Brisker with a gaze too intense to be simple annoyance. Darius's eyes narrowed as he read the posture, the micro-movements, the way Keldrick's hand hovered just past his own knee. Everything about his body language now signaled action. Darius spoke low to his son. "I've got you." Because it wasn't a matter of if anymore, it was when. And then Keldrick's eyes darkened, not with fear or frustration, but resolve, the kind that broke things. The moment Keldrick's eyes narrowed at Brisker, Darius knew the line between irritation and danger was about to break. Brisker's tail flicked out from the side of the soft-sided carrier, just a gentle sweep like any cat stretching lazily, but that one motion set everything in motion. Keldrick's eyes snapped toward the flicker with sudden precision, like a trigger had been pulled inside his brain. Without warning, he thrust his boot sideways across the narrow aisle, striking the carrier with a sharp thud. The blow was angled low but fast, hitting the edge hard enough to jolt the entire structure. Brisker let out a yelp, high-pitched, panicked, fragile. The sound sliced through the cabin air like a broken alarm. Rowan burst into tears. Gasps scattered across the nearby rows. A plastic cup tumbled from a tray. Marin Jarrus, returning from the galley, broke into a run the moment he saw the carrier rattle. "Sir, stop!" he shouted, voice rising above the chaos. But Keldrick didn't flinch. His face twisted into mock offense. "It scratched me. That animal scratched me," he barked, loud enough to draw attention from passengers several rows back. His voice cracked in places, not from pain, but from something deeper. A performance, a cover, an excuse forming in real time. The dramatic irony struck with precision. Marin knew Keldrick had been flagged. A pre-boarding note had marked him as a potential problem. He was supposed to be watched, but not barred, company policy after all. Yet nobody had thought to warn Darius. Nobody had thought the flagged man would target the quiet father with a baby and a cat. Darius's reaction was instinctive, trained, not rage, but absolute clarity. With Rowan still crying in his left arm, he reached down and pulled the carrier tightly against his right thigh, shielding both child and animal. Brisker trembled inside, eyes wide, body curled tight in fear. The muscles in Darius's back shifted as he adjusted his position in the seat, protective, strategic, coiled like a spring ready to snap. Across the aisle, Keldrick leaned forward, no longer pretending to be calm. "You shouldn't bring animals around kids. They're unpredictable. Dangerous," he sneered. "The only dangerous thing here is your foot," Darius said, his voice calm but piercing. His tone cut through the tension like a suppressed warning shot. Marin stepped in, one arm extended between the two. "Sir, return to your seat. Now, or you will be restrained under airline protocol." Keldrick ignored him, tilting in his seat like a pendulum gaining swing. His foot shifted back, heels aligning as if preparing for another strike. Darius saw it. Not just the movement, but the intent. He had seen this type before. Not soldiers, not even fighters, but instigators. men who provoked until a reaction gave them license to escalate. Around them, passengers froze in stunned silence. A teenage boy across the aisle clutched his backpack to his chest. An elderly man shook his head, whispering something under his breath. A middle-aged businessman 2 rows back lifted his phone to begin filming, though his hands trembled. Tension moved like static through the cabin. Then Keldrick shifted again. His right leg coiled, boot rising slightly from the floor. Not a twitch, not a tremor, a wind-up. Darius's mind switched instantly. No more second chances, no more warnings. His breathing slowed, even as Rowan's cries peaked beside him. He traced Keldrick's posture like reading coordinates, calculating distance, timing, risk of collateral. Keldrick's foot came up, higher this time, more direct. The trajectory was unmistakable. Not a flinch, not a threat. A deliberate attempt to harm. The cabin seemed to narrow as if the walls leaned inward, focusing all space and sound into a single, suspended moment. Darius spoke only once inside his own head. Now. Rowan sobbed, face buried in his father's shirt. Brisker whimpered, flattening in the corner of the carrier. Marin shouted something again, but it was lost to the pressure in the cabin. Darius felt his heart beat once, twice, then steady itself like it always had before a shot. A single decision. Restraint or revelation? He had spent years burying what he was. But now, the threat wasn't abstract. It wasn't theoretical. It was inches from his son's head. He moved slightly in his seat, not rising yet, not committing to escalation, but ready. 1 second more and— "Keldrick," Marin warned, "you're one motion away from federal charges." Keldrick didn't stop. Instead, he grinned. A crooked, victorious grin. One that belonged on men who enjoyed tipping peace into chaos. The kind of grin Darius remembered from villages torn apart by single instigators. He understood then. This wasn't about animals or noise. It wasn't even about control. It was about provocation. Keldrick wanted to break something. Someone. And Darius had just decided it wouldn't be his son. The next foot movement would determine everything. But Darius was no longer just watching. He was positioning. His grip around Rowan changed, more secure. His leg moved slightly, not to attack, but to block if needed. His spine straightened, ready to rise with calm force. All eyes were on the confrontation, but no one moved. The passengers were frozen. The flight crew hesitated, caught between policy and urgency. Keldrick's boot lifted again. The second Keldrick lifted his foot again, Darius realized the mission had officially begun. The kick had landed. The carrier had jolted. The silence afterward was louder than any scream. Darius didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for permission. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the older man seated beside him. Harvin Kez, mid-60s, gray-streaked beard, steady hands, the kind of hands that once held a train's throttle through snowstorms. A man Darius had already marked in his mental recon as composed, civilian, but dependable. Without a word, Darius lifted Rowan and placed him in Harvin's arms with the same calm precision he would have used passing off a field package under fire. Harvin blinked but said nothing, instinctively adjusting his grip around the infant. Rowan whimpered softly, his small frame tense, still frightened by the sudden commotion. Darius stood. The motion was slow, deliberate, not a single wasted gesture. Trained muscles engaged with fluid economy. Not a threat, not a panic, but every set of eyes in the cabin turned toward him as if gravity itself shifted. Passengers leaned back into their seats. One man near the exit instinctively placed a hand on his armrest. Marin Jarrus, halfway up the aisle, froze mid-step. Darius stepped into the aisle and faced Keldrick Vaughn. The man who had kicked at a baby's pet now wore the face of someone trying to recalculate. His earlier fury faltered into confusion. The fire in his eyes flickered, unsure whether to burn or retreat. His mouth twitched into a smirk that didn't belong, more defense mechanism than confidence. "Sit down before this becomes something else," Darius said. The words landed with weight far heavier than their volume. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply stated, as one states a law of nature, "If it rains, you get wet. If you rise again, I end this." But Keldrick was the kind of man who mistook calm for cowardice. He scoffed and gripped the edge of his seat, beginning to push himself upright. That was his mistake. Darius moved, not fast, not flashy, but surgically. His right hand locked onto Keldrick's wrist, his left pressed beneath the shoulder joint. A twist, a drop, and just enough pressure, pinpointed and perfect, to collapse leverage without inflicting lasting harm. Keldrick's knees buckled. His seat caught him before the aisle floor could. He exhaled sharply in pain, a hiss escaping through clenched teeth. His eyes went wide, not from the pain itself, but from the realization that it came with no warning, no warm-up, no effort. Marin gasped, caught between protocol and paralysis. The passengers didn't speak, but their stares were thunderous. What they had witnessed didn't resemble violence. It resembled restraint wearing the armor of mastery. The dramatic irony deepened. They still didn't know who Darius was, but they knew now what he wasn't. Someone to test. Keldrick twisted against the hold instinctively. "You're assaulting me," he shouted. "I'll sue. The cat scratched me. The baby triggered me." His voice cracked near the end. Not fury, fear. A younger man across the aisle leaned toward the center. "Then maybe," he said just loud enough for the row to hear, "you shouldn't have kicked at a baby's pet." Darius released his grip with quiet precision. Keldrick recoiled, clutching his wrist, breathing ragged. He didn't rise again. Marin raised a hand to his earpiece and tapped it twice. "Requesting backup to cabin midsection," he spoke into the intercom mic. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled slightly. Darius leaned in close, lowering his head until his mouth was inches from Keldrick's ear. Whatever he whispered was inaudible to everyone else, but the effect was immediate. Keldrick froze. His posture collapsed inward. The color drained from his face. He didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't even breathe heavily. His body curled subtly toward the window, as if retreating from something that couldn't be seen. Darius stood, his eyes sweeping the cabin once more. Several passengers avoided his gaze. A few nodded silently, as if acknowledging a truth they hadn't known they needed. Not all heroes wear name tags or uniforms. Behind him, Brisker whimpered softly inside the carrier. Darius knelt beside it for a moment, brushing a steadying hand along the top, whispering something quiet enough that only the cat and his own son could hear. Harvin looked down at Rowan, then up at Darius with something between admiration and concern. "He's fine," Harvin said, voice low. Still hiccuping, but calm. Darius nodded once. "Thank you." The flight crew coordinated with ground security over the comms. Protocols activated. The cockpit confirmed monitoring. When Darius finally returned to his seat, securing Rowan in his arms and Brisker by his feet, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of shift. And as every passenger turned away, pretending to read, sleep, or scroll through phones, they all carried the same thought. Something had just changed. And Keldrick never moved again. Darius sat still, eyes narrowed as Marin approached quietly and offered a bottle of water. The bottle shook slightly in the attendant's hand, a tremor he failed to hide. "Thank you," Darius said, but pushed it gently aside. "I need only one thing. Don't let him near us again." Marin nodded, stealing a glance toward Keldrick Vaughn, who now slouched in his seat like a deflated balloon. The man who had moments earlier kicked at a child's comfort animal now looked eerily detached, cradling his arm as if the subtle technique Darius had used had rewired his nerves. He didn't move, didn't mutter, didn't blink much. The cabin had grown quieter, but not more peaceful. It was the silence of unease, like after a storm, when everyone waits to see if the second wave is coming. Then, with a glance over his shoulder, a different attendant approached Marin. His name tag read Jorn Pell, and his complexion was pale enough to suggest he wasn't coming over to ask about beverage carts. He leaned in and whispered something that instantly altered the atmosphere between them. Marin's face twitched. "Say that again?" "I double-checked the manifest," Jorn whispered, his voice barely audible. "Keldrick's name isn't on it. Not anywhere. He wasn't assigned a seat by dispatch." Darius didn't react immediately, but his peripheral hearing, trained from years in hostile zones, caught every syllable. His spine straightened with invisible tension. A non-manifested passenger? On a domestic flight? That wasn't just a red flag. It was a signal flare. Marin turned halfway toward Darius. "He wasn't listed?" "No," Jorn confirmed. "He was added manually. I dug into the back end. The override code used is from internal crew systems." Darius slowly exhaled through his nose, not looking away from Rowan's small, sleeping form. His voice, when it came, was level. "Those codes are for emergency swaps, not walk-ons." "Exactly," Marin murmured, now visibly shaken. "They're used when a crew member needs to be moved or reassigned. This one's marked EXOP, External Operations Override." "That system doesn't have access to this route," Darius replied coldly. "Only internal gate agents tied to Halden Air's crew shift scheduler can approve those changes. Anything outside that means someone forced it." For the first time, Marin stopped trying to maintain professionalism. His hands trembled as he clutched the iPad from his apron. "But I saw his badge. It scanned red for clearance delay but turned green on second pass. That usually happens when a late entry is syncing to the network manifest." "Or when someone manually overrides the red," Darius said, standing halfway and leaning slightly over Marin's shoulder. "Go back to Gate 47's logs. Tell me which terminal pushed that clearance." Marin hesitated, then retreated down the aisle toward the galley to consult the cockpit. Darius's mind moved faster than his pulse. Someone had used a back-end access point to insert a hostile variable into a civilian flight. The variables didn't add up, not yet, but he'd seen enough to trust instinct over evidence. Keldrick's earlier aggression hadn't felt spontaneous. It had followed stages, escalation cues, micro-provocations, almost like testing reactions. He glanced toward the front of the cabin and caught Keldrick still hunched, but his posture now seemed performative, like a man pretending to feel defeated. No shifting, no nervous tics, just stillness too perfect to be real. Darius's eyes narrowed. "That grip I used, it was tactical, but not disabling. He's exaggerating pain to avoid drawing suspicion." Beside him, Harvin Kez, the older man who'd taken Rowan earlier, cleared his throat softly. "I worked long enough around freight trains to know when someone's pretending to be still," he said without looking. "He's waiting, not hurting." Marin returned minutes later, pale as chalk. It came from an access port labeled OBR-24. That's an external terminal. It's not supposed to have route-level control. Darius's expression darkened. OBR-24 is a decommissioned console, he said slowly. Used to belong to long-haul operations. Who had login credentials? "No staff name attached," Marin said. "Just Echo, retired." And there it was. That name hadn't been uttered in years, not officially. Echo was the informal designation for Corvin Rell, a former systems operations lead for the Sentinel Crest Logistics Division. Vanished 5 years ago during the program's shutdown sweep. Darius's stomach dropped, not from fear, but from understanding. This wasn't about Brisker, or Rowan's minor fussing, or a flight gone tense. It was about him. "Someone wanted to see how I'd respond," he said aloud, "in a confined space, with a child, with civilians." Marin's voice dropped to a whisper. "Are you saying this whole thing was orchestrated?" Darius didn't reply. His eyes returned to Keldrick, still unmoving. Then he looked further back, his memory catching up with a small detail from boarding. A man in uniform had studied his boarding pass too long. Not scanned it, studied it, as if matching the name with something deeper than a flight record. Darius hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, like threads pulled through a sniper scope, it all snapped together. A silent test, a planned escalation, an override from a ghost. Brisker let out a soft meow as if sensing his master's focus. Darius bent forward, gently sliding his hand across the top of the carrier and whispering something only the cat and himself could hear. When he looked up, his voice was low and sure. "This wasn't about a cat," Darius murmured. "This was a probe." The cabin lights dimmed for evening cruise, softening the edges of reality into something deceptively peaceful. But Darius Rennick knew better. He tightened the clip on Brisker's carrier and adjusted the blanket around Rowan's tiny form. The baby's breath came steady, soothing. That alone was enough to remind Darius why control, absolute, unemotional control, was necessary. Stillness was not peace. Silence was not safety. He slid his hand into the side compartment of his backpack and retrieved a small black case no larger than a deck of cards. Without ceremony, he opened it and peeled off a biometric pulse patch, the adhesive cool against his wrist. Once in place, it blinked a dull blue. The interface was old, unofficial, and entirely untraceable. He hadn't used it in years, but the satellite uplink still engaged. A single vibration confirmed its sync with a military-grade alert network that shouldn't exist anymore. Beside him, Harvin Kez shifted slightly in his seat. The older man's voice was quiet, but steady. "You knew he wasn't just angry, didn't you?" Darius didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked forward, then back toward row 14, where Keldrick Vaughn sat motionless, staring straight ahead. "That was a stress test," Darius finally said. "For me." Harvin's brow furrowed. "A test?" Marin reappeared at that moment, leaning down with a piece of folded paper and a phone gripped tightly in his other hand. His face was pale under the cabin lights, his voice even lower than before. "We checked the code used to override the manifest. It belonged to a former Sentinel Crest logistics officer." Darius didn't move. Marin continued. "One who vanished 5 years ago. No discharge. No record of reassignment." Darius's lips pressed into a thin line. That name, that code, that access. It was a ghost from a chapter of his life that should have stayed closed. "He was presumed dead," Darius said without inflection. "Maybe he's not," Marin replied grimly. It hit Darius then, not like a revelation, but a confirmation. This flight wasn't about a pet or a disturbed passenger. It was about exposure, observation, a test of loyalty, temperament, instinct. Someone had arranged Keldrick's presence to watch what Darius would do under strain, with Rowan present, with Brisker vulnerable, and with no clear fallback. If he failed, what would have happened to his son? Darius leaned back and pulled a small cloth over Rowan's legs. The biometric patch pulsed again, twice in succession. He turned his wrist just enough to check the alert. A soft ping rolled across the display. Access logged. Pediatric biometric records. Rowan Rennick. Timestamp 2:03 p.m. His eyes narrowed. That was 2 hours before takeoff, long before the supposed incident began. A sharp inhale cut through the tension beside him. Harvin had seen the alert. "They checked your baby's file?" "Medical," Darius confirmed. "Pre-boarding." "Is that normal?" "No." His voice held steel now. And it wasn't a coincidence. He disconnected the patch and folded his arms slowly, not to rest, but to anchor his thoughts. The timing wasn't random. The hostility hadn't been either. Someone knew Rowan's condition. Someone wanted to see how Darius would respond under pressure while simultaneously evaluating Rowan's value. He looked to Keldrick again, still motionless. No fidgeting, no blinking. Too perfect. Whoever sent him, Darius muttered, didn't send a man. They sent a signal. Harvin glanced over. Then what do? We don't react emotionally. That's what they want. He checked the clip on Brisker's carrier again and whispered to the cat, whose eyes stared up, wide and alert. We let them think they saw enough. The cabin around them hummed with false comfort. Some passengers dozed off. Others watched muted films. But Darius's mind sliced through the calm like a blade. If Sentinel Crest was truly gone, why were its ghosts surfacing now? If Rowan's file had been accessed, what else had been compromised? He drew a mental map of every detail since boarding. The gate agent who lingered too long over his ID, the brief flicker on the flight manifest screen, Marin's pause in the aisle before takeoff. Everything was too precise, too orchestrated. A ripple passed through the fuselage as the aircraft shifted slightly with a change in wind. Darius didn't even blink. But Keldrick, he remained completely still. No subconscious flinch, no muscle tightening, no breath catch. A civilian couldn't fake that. Harvin, Darius said without looking. He's not who he pretended to be. The older man didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders said enough. Darius's voice dropped. His reactions were too calculated. That kick, it was bait. Marin returned once more, visibly shaken. We've secured the front cabin and notified Marrow City Ground Command. But something else. Darius met his gaze. They flagged a second code, traced back to an external operations terminal that shouldn't have had clearance to this route. It was activated during final boarding. Of course it was. The patch on his wrist blinked again. No new alert this time. Just the steady heartbeat of a network still listening, still watching. He looked at Rowan, peaceful, unaware. Brisker had curled beside him again, one paw stretched protectively near the baby's side. They were watching to see if I'd break, Darius whispered. Did you? Harvin asked. Darius shook his head, his eyes cold now. No, but I know this isn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees as the hum of the engines deepened. Keldrick hadn't moved. Neither had the danger. But Darius was no longer thinking like a passenger. He was preparing like a guardian trained for long shadows and hidden war. Darius looked down at his son's peaceful face and knew, whatever this was, it had just begun. The passenger smirked, confident his cruelty would go unpunished, unaware that every movement, every angle, and every witness had already been accounted for by a man who never misses a target. If you believe abuse under privilege always folds when strategy meets deadly precision, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Keldrick stood, no announcement, no rustle of clothing, no glance to the side. Just a fluid motion of rising from his seat, as silent as a shadow stretching across the floor of a darkened room. Darius noticed instantly. His eyes locked onto the man's back as Keldrick turned with unnerving calm and began walking down the aisle toward the rear of the aircraft. Each step was measured, not hesitant, not hurried, just precise. Harvin, seated beside Darius, shifted slightly as if to speak, but Darius lifted a hand, not to stop him, but to silence the air itself. His eyes never left Keldrick. He hasn't eaten, hasn't blinked properly, Darius muttered under his breath. That stillness? That's not fear. That's training. Harvin glanced at him. What kind of training? The kind that doesn't flinch during chaos. A subtle tremor passed through the fuselage as the turbulence warning chimed overhead. Most passengers instinctively glanced up or grabbed their armrests. Keldrick didn't even flinch. Not even a flicker of muscle in his neck. He moved as if the cabin were still. Darius's thoughts raced. Everything about the man's composure had been wrong from the start. The way he delivered that first kick, too intentional, too theatrical. Not wild or impulsive, but controlled, as if designed to provoke, not injure. Now it was clear. That aggression wasn't a breakdown. It was a test. Darius unbuckled his belt slowly, keeping his motion fluid and unthreatening, the way a panther might descend from a branch without disturbing a single leaf. He whispered to Harvin, "If anything happens, hold Rowan, no matter what." Harvin nodded, already wrapping both arms around the infant more protectively, Brisker's soft ears twitching from beneath the carrier flap as if he too sensed a shift in atmosphere. Darius followed. He stayed back, one row short, watching. Keldrick approached the rear lavatory but didn't open the door in full. He pushed it ajar with the back of his hand and stood in the narrow space, angled slightly, head lowered, not enough to enter, not enough to close himself in. Instead, he reached into his pocket and, with almost reverent precision, dropped something onto the floor just outside the lavatory. It made no sound as it landed. Then, without another motion, he stepped inside and shut the door. Darius approached slowly. The aircraft engine hummed beneath the floor. Overhead, cabin lights flickered with minor turbulence, casting long shadows across the aisle carpet. The passengers behind him didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They were distracted by screens, headphones, or mild nausea. He crouched, picked up the item. A folded slip of paper, unmarked. But when he opened it, the breath caught in his throat, not from surprise but recognition. The symbol was unmistakable. The jagged crest of a hawk's wing shattered down the center, once red, now only drawn in faint graphite. The broken crest of Sentinel Crest's Red Protocol. A unit that no longer officially existed. A unit that had been disbanded after a classified defection scandal. A unit that trained operatives not just to kill, but to extract, to interrogate, to manipulate from within. Darius stared at it, heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of clarity. The message wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation, a signal, not meant for any passenger, not for the crew. It was meant only for him. The seatbelt sign blinked to life with a soft chime just as the captain's voice announced final descent. Marin Jarrus moved quickly but quietly down the aisle, leaning in toward Darius without breaking stride. "Do you want to file an official report beyond the assault?" Marin asked, his voice barely above the hum of the engines. Darius didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket and handed Marin the slip of paper, creased now, smudged at the corners. On it, the broken crest of Red Protocol stared up like a scar from a forgotten war. "He'll disappear before the gate opens," Darius said flatly, his voice composed but stripped of any illusions. Marin blinked. "Disappear? But he's right there." Darius didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on seat 27D. Keldrick Vaughn's seat. Except it was empty. Empty. The words didn't register at first. Marin stepped past Darius, his movements quickening, stopping beside the row that had once held a man who now, inexplicably, was gone. The safety card remained tucked neatly behind the tray table. The seatbelt lay unclipped, coiled like a snake in the shadows. No sign of struggle, no sign of panic, and no sign of Keldrick. Passengers nearby were preoccupied with the usual post-landing shuffle, stretching arms, checking phones, unbuckling with relief. No one had noticed anything strange. No one had seen Keldrick leave. Not toward the front. Not toward the rear. He had vanished into the soft noise of disembarkation readiness. Marin's voice cracked as he tapped his comm. "This is Lead Attendant Jarrus. I need security sweep on seat 27D. Passenger missing. Manifest says he's aboard. Visual says otherwise." Seconds later, uniformed officers entered through the forward hatch. The aircraft had only just rolled to a stop, but already the crew was scrambling to isolate passengers, verify names, and delay disembarkation. The manhunt had begun, but there was no trail. Just that empty seat, and a faint, almost imperceptible scent rising from the cushions. Darius moved closer, sniffed, and whispered, Ammonia. Marin looked at him, puzzled. Used to mask chemical residues, Darius added, quietly, calmly, the sniper in him calculating every detail with precise detachment. While security combed the plane with flashlights and passenger manifests, the rest of the cabin buzzed with confused relief. Some passengers believed the drama was over. They had watched a father stand up to a bully, and now they thought they were watching the cleanup. They didn't know that the real incident had only just begun, because what none of them could see was Darius removing the laminated safety card in front of him, slipping his fingers into the narrow hollow behind it. He pulled gently, feeling the resistance of a hidden latch he hadn't touched in years. Behind the panel, a small silver disc glinted, a comm node, obsolete to most, still alive for those who remembered. He slid the disc open, exposing a fiber-thin antenna and screen no bigger than a matchbox. It glowed once, awaiting voice. Darius leaned in. His voice, low and even, activated the secure channel. Red protocol is active. Civilian cover breached. Target passed control test. There was a pause. Static flickered like old ghosts. Then Darius spoke again. Securing asset. He didn't say Rowan's name. Didn't have to. The word asset wasn't cold, it was encoded. Because Rowan wasn't just a boy with a rare neurological condition. He was the reason this flight had been chosen. The reason Keldrick had been inserted. The reason this entire situation, every movement, every reaction, every delay, had been engineered like a live simulation. Rowan stirred softly in his arms. The baby's lashes fluttered. Brisker meowed faintly from his carrier, tucked close to Darius's feet. The sounds brought Darius back to the moment, not as a sniper, not as a sentinel, but as a father. A father who now understood with clarity that someone had come not for him, but for his child. He scanned the cabin one more time. None of the passengers knew. Not the man filming from row 15, not the elderly traveler with the walking cane, not even Harvin, who sat stoic beside them, aware something had happened but not its scale. They all saw a protective father. They didn't see the man tracing invisible threads between governments, failed programs, and biological anomalies. The landing had been smooth. The applause from the rear cabin had been polite. From the outside, everything looked safe. But inside, Darius was now operating under a different reality. Rowan, his infant son, was the reason someone had reactivated an abandoned branch of Sentinel Crest's most controversial experiment. A program long thought buried after a defection scandal, now resurfaced not in a lab, but mid-air, cloaked in domestic travel and petty conflict. They didn't try to take the child. Not yet. They tested the father, and Darius had passed. As the passengers cheered the safe landing, Darius quietly realized someone had come for the boy and tested his father first. The wheels screeched softly as Flight 772 came to a full stop at Gate 47. The moment the seatbelt sign clicked off, the cabin stirred with motion. Overhead compartments creaked open, coats shuffled, and voices murmured in relief. But something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Keldrick Vaughn is gone, Marin whispered to the first officer near the cockpit. His voice trembled under the weight of disbelief. Gone. The man who had kicked toward a child's comfort animal. The man who'd left a symbol from a defunct covert program. The man who should have been escorted off first. Now, vanished. Not a soul had seen him disembark. No trace of him entering another lavatory. No confirmation from the front or rear doors. Just a neatly upright seat, seatbelt fastened, and a faint chemical scent lingering in the air. Ammonia. A known residue masker. As the crew scrambled to contact airport security, Darius remained seated, calm, almost detached. Passengers filtered out slowly, confused by the holdup but unaware of the true reason. He made no move to leave. Instead, he leaned over Rowan's carrier, brushing the infant's forehead gently. Brisker stirred at his feet, letting out a soft meow as if sensing that the mission was not yet over. Then, methodically, Darius began the real work. While appearing to check the storage under the seat, he retrieved a thin security mat and slipped it beneath Rowan's bottle warmer. From it, he extracted a chip no larger than a fingernail, slim, gray, and heat-shielded. Not Rowan's biometrics. That file had never been stored electronically. This chip held something else, the last archived neural logs of Dr. Corlin Vess, a civilian specialist who had studied the visual spatial recall condition Rowan now exhibited, and who vanished just days before Sentinel Crest officially dissolved. As Darius palmed the chip, the dots connected with surgical clarity. This flight, this incident, this confrontation, it had all been orchestrated. Rowan's condition wasn't just a medical curiosity anymore, it was a trigger, a magnet, and someone out there wanted proof it had passed down into a viable child, but they hadn't gone for the boy directly. No. First, they tested the protector. Darius scanned the cabin again. A man near row 14 had glanced at him twice during boarding, yet avoided eye contact since. A younger attendant had fumbled his tray cart only when passing their row, never before. And someone, somewhere, had signed off on that override manifest code that placed Keldrick on board undetected. Every detail pointed to planning. Layered. Precise. Not a single word had been said to Darius after the lavatory incident. Not by Keldrick, not by anyone who mattered. But silence was a language of its own in his former world. Was that man sent for you? Marin's voice broke through the tension, quiet but shaking. He stood near the rear bulkhead, eyes darting from passenger to crew as security gathered outside the door, waiting for a statement. Darius didn't turn immediately. He held Rowan closer, anchoring himself to the only purpose that mattered now. Then he looked up, not coldly, but with the hollow intensity of a man who'd re-entered an old battlefield disguised as a cabin. "If anyone else asks," he said, voice low and measured, "you never saw me use that grip." The flight attendant's lips parted, but no reply came. Marin simply nodded, slow, firm, eyes widened by something deeper than shock. It wasn't just that he had witnessed violence. It was that he had witnessed control, precision, intent that didn't come from fear or anger, but duty. Outside, uniformed personnel clustered at the jet bridge. Passengers grew frustrated at the delay, huddled in the terminal with half-stamped passports and questions no one could answer. Agents barked into radios, arguing over missing footage. Gate surveillance erased. In under 3 minutes. One file showed static. Another black screen. An internal audit already traced the clearance badge used to wipe it. Varen Colt. Once a commanding officer. Once declared dead. Darius didn't wait for resolution. He already had it. The flight had been a live test of response, of restraint, of readiness, and not for an agency. For him, the sniper-turned-father. They hadn't sent Keldrick to break him. They sent him to measure him. As Brisker curled back into the carrier and Rowan yawned in half-sleep, Darius stood. His body moved not like a man disembarking a flight, but like one exiting a debriefing. The mission had changed, and Darius had just passed it, because they weren't testing a soldier. They were testing a father. "Your child's file was accessed remotely," Dr. Lucen Merrick said, his eyes narrowed at the digital chart glowing on his tablet. 3 times in the last week. That's not normal. The words landed like a quiet detonation in the sterile examination room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the clean tiles, the blood pressure machine in the corner, and the silent weight of Darius's presence. Rowan, bundled in a soft gray blanket, lay on the padded examination bench beside him, breathing slowly, peacefully. But Darius's own breath had sharpened, almost imperceptibly. He leaned forward with calculated calm. 3 times? From where? Lucan tapped through the access logs. The pings came from 3 different networks. 2 were routed through encrypted servers, military-grade tunneling, but outdated. The third was more sophisticated, almost civilian, but it used something odd, like a Sentinel echo code, obsolete but not forgotten. Darius masked his reaction with a soft nod, but inside something cold unfurled. His mind was already moving, tracing the digital backflow of those accesses, reviewing names and sequences he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "I'll have our IT team look deeper," Luton offered. "Could be some internal testing or a sync issue with your upload system from the referral hospital." "No need," Darius said, standing. "You've done enough." Luton paused, sensing the shift in tone. "Is there something you're not telling me, Mr. Rennick?" Darius smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll follow up if I need more detail." Outside the diagnostic center, the air was damp with morning mist. Darius adjusted Rowan's hood as they passed the bronze statue at the entrance, an angel cradling a child in one arm, a compass in the other. The irony didn't escape him. The moment they returned to the hotel, Darius set Rowan in his crib and powered up an old military-issue pad, modified long ago to work on both civilian and GhostNet bandwidths. He inserted a single encrypted coin, his last remaining link to a man most believed dead, Elior Trask. On screen, an interface blinked once, then again. Verify. Darius typed, "Operative call sign, Warden 17. Credentials validated. Objective?" He typed, "Purge biometric traces, Rowan Rennick. Public, private, shadow registries, full sweep." There was a long pause before the final reply came. "Payment?" Darius held up a small black coin, an old, untraceable military token called a Spectra Disc. He placed it on the scanner, watching as its edges glowed. Once it faded, the message changed. "Task accepted. Completion. ETA, 48 hours. Closure, permanent. Contact, null." The line severed. He exhaled slowly, then returned to Rowan's side. The boy was asleep, cheeks flushed with health, fingers curled into tiny fists that had never held a weapon, never carried a code, never been trained to see enemies in silence. A child, not an asset. And yet someone had looked for him. Someone had tried to resurrect whispers from a time Darius thought buried. Generation V. A failed program built on hope and hubris. Infants with nonlinear spatial memory formations, tested for their potential to create living maps, navigation-enhancing implants, or predictive visual threads. It had been shut down when the anomalies proved too erratic, too human. But some within Sentinel believed the program hadn't failed, it had simply gone dark. Was Rowan one of them? No. He was not created for war. He was born of grace, of struggle, of survival, and he would not be turned into a tool. The rest of the day passed in quiet watchfulness. Darius ordered no room service, answered no calls. Brisker stayed close, sensing the unease, curling up beside Rowan as though standing guard. Darius spent the evening tracing firewall patterns, watching for further pings, but found nothing. Yet silence, he knew, was sometimes more dangerous than noise. At 1 a.m., Brisker climbed onto his lap. The gentle rumble of his purr blended with the hush of Rowan's breath. For the first time, Darius let the moment slow. He watched his son's chest rise and fall in rhythm. No alarms, no alerts, just peace. He realized this was what it meant to win, not to outmaneuver a threat, but to protect something uncorrupted. No shadows loomed in the room tonight. No past operative had breached the door. There were no codes to crack or shots to fire, just a boy and his cat, and the man who would let the world burn before letting them be taken. For the first time, Darius wasn't shielding an asset or guarding intel. He was just guarding peace. The footage vanished in exactly 2 minutes and 57 seconds. At 1943 local time, 3 minutes after Flight 772 touched down, every frame of surveillance from Halden Gate 47 was overwritten. Not corrupted, not delayed, erased and replaced with a static loop showing idle luggage carts and an empty jet bridge. The digital signature matched Clearance Protocol Zeta 9, a security badge not seen in circulation for over 7 years. That badge belonged to one man, Varen Colt, and Varen Colt was supposed to be dead. Darius Rennick stared at the encrypted ping on his screen, his jaw locked and unmoving. The silent alert blinked once, then disappeared. Confirmation, not just of the wipe, but of who authorized it. The timing was surgical. The style was unmistakable, and the implications were terrifying. Red Protocol hadn't just been reactivated, it was being rebuilt, in silence, from the inside. He didn't pace. He never paced. Instead, he sat in the dim hotel room beside Rowan's portable crib, Brisker curled tightly against the wall, watching the laptop's reflection flicker across Darius's eyes. Outside, Marrow City's rain tapped the windows like a second hand counting down. The memory of Keldrick Vaughn's disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It was part of something orchestrated, something vast. Darius typed a name into the dark-pane terminal, Jorek Van. There was no need for introduction, no subject line, no background explanation, just a message written with cold clarity. They're trying to start it again, with children. He hit send. Then he shut the laptop and exhaled slowly, his first full breath in hours. Brisker's tail twitched once but didn't rise. Rowan shifted, half asleep, fingers curled toward his father's coat as if anchoring to it. By the next morning, Darius had his answer. Not in words, not in calls, not even in a digital reply. Just a silent confirmation from his former network's dead channel, once reserved for emergency recovery only. A string of 6 identifiers lit up on the dormant comm board. Darius recognized each one. 5 of them belonged to former Sentinel operatives who had vanished after the collapse of the unit. Men who'd faked deaths, scrubbed names, or buried themselves in lives far away from conflict. Now, one by one, they were reappearing. Not for vengeance, not for revival, but for resistance. He ran a hand down his jaw. His fingers paused near the old scar behind his left ear, a souvenir from a deflection mission gone sideways. Back then, they had operated under strict hierarchy. Colt was commander. Darius was Field Tier 3, sniper, extraction lead, and rear evac in a team that had no fallback plan. After the fallout of Sentinel Crest, Colt had vanished into presumed death. Whispers of suicide. Rumors of betrayal. Darius had chosen not to chase them. But the gate wipe changed everything. The surveillance erasure, the forged boarding clearance for Keldrick, the red protocol symbol, all of it pointed to something organized and dangerous. It wasn't just an isolated probe against Darius. It was a controlled test, measuring response, timing, and emotional tolerance. But most disturbingly, it involved Rowan. A baby. His baby. And that changed the rules. Later that evening, Darius made his way to the Marrow City Records Annex, not as a soldier, not as a whistleblower, but as a father walking through bureaucratic fog. The digital records he accessed confirmed what he feared. Rowan's biometric scans had been queried again. A third time, from a terminal listed under an inactive medical research tag in Trenfall District, 600 miles away. The system flagged the access as unusual activity, but hadn't blocked it. The queries were coded as research, but Darius recognized the metadata tags. GVISLOC9, Generation V, Location Prediction, Neural Mapping Trials. He stepped back from the screen. They were trying to reclassify Rowan, not as a patient, as an asset. Outside the annex, he didn't return home immediately. He took the long way, bypassing commercial hubs, watching reflections in every store window, every crosswalk signal. He used to do this for survival. Now it was second nature. A man who knew how to disappear but chose not to, because the moment he vanished, Rowan became vulnerable. Back at the hotel, Brisker met him at the door with a low meow. not fear, just alertness. Darius locked the door with a double check and powered up a secure burner tablet. There was one more person he needed to contact. Not an ally, not a friend, but a firewall. Elliot Trask, a former data scrubber turned myth. If anyone could ghost Rowan's existence from the entire biometric lattice, it was him. The price was steep. Darius paid it in seconds, a one-time transfer of the last untraceable military coin he had. One coin, one promise, one future erased from the wrong hands. As Trask's message confirmed, child now indexed as null, biometric trace purged, cellular drift reset. No one will find him, not even me. Darius closed the tablet. Later that night, as Rowan shifted in his sleep, a soft blue glow from a city street lamp illuminated his face. For a moment, the world outside fell away. The conspiracies, the protocols, the surveillance, they dissolved in the steady sound of his child's breath. Brisker climbed softly into Darius's lap, pressing close. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Because now, more than ever, silence was survival. And far away, in places where light didn't reach, others had begun to stir. Former operatives, broken signals, hidden codes. A new resistance was forming, not to restart the program, but to ensure it never returned. They had no intention of restarting the program, but they would stop anyone else from doing it. The knock at the door came softly, just once, and then silence. Darius lowered his pen and looked up. The small lamp on the desk cast a warm glow over the edge of his manuscript, but the rest of the room was shadows. Rowan was asleep across the suite in the crib, one arm slung over Brisker's curled body. Darius rose quietly and approached the door, barefoot, unarmed, but far from defenseless. He paused to listen. Nothing. With a fluid motion, he unlatched the lock and opened the door a fraction. No one. But down the hall, at the corner where the camera's view would blur, a folded note had been left on the floor. Darius retrieved it and closed the door, sliding the chain lock across. He unfolded the note under the lamplight. It held only a symbol. The Sentinel mark, cut once through the center. Not the red protocol symbol. This was older. A glyph used only once, during a mission that never made it to official records. A warning, passed hand to hand among operatives when the command chain could no longer be trusted. Darius burned the paper in the hotel kettle before returning to his seat. The flame curled the edges silently, smoke venting through the whisper of steam. This wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. He glanced at the crib. Rowan stirred in his sleep, one hand forming a tiny fist. Brisker's tail twitched protectively. That image grounded him more than any tactical anchor ever had. In the following weeks, Darius withdrew from all known networks. He used his final clearance token to open one untraceable line, just long enough to ping a set of coordinates only Sentinel ghosts would recognize. Then he disappeared. Not physically, but strategically. Under the pseudonym Thalen Merrick, he began writing. The first novel was called Through the Eye of Stone. It read like speculative fiction. Space operatives, hidden agendas. A child whose memory could reroute satellites. Readers called it brilliant. Critics said it was absurd. But buried in the dedication, printed in faint ink that only appeared under heat, was a code. The exact extraction coordinates used during Operation Hollowcrest. Only one reader would notice. Only one needed to. He published 6 novels in 14 months, each a variation, each a warning, not about war, but about its silent return. Rowan's condition stabilized, though the doctors admitted they'd never seen anything quite like it. His mind built spatial memory the way others built language. Rooms mapped in seconds, paths remembered after one glance. At night, he built towers of blocks that mirrored floor plans he'd only crawled through once. Darius kept these findings quiet, even from Lucen Merrick, their trusted pediatric specialist. Any data became threat. Any profile became a target. One night, Rowan asked a question that stopped Darius cold. "Was I ever in danger, Dad?" Darius turned from the window, where he had been watching the lights of the city fade into evening fog. His expression softened, but a pulse of tension lingered beneath the surface. He knelt beside Rowan's bed, brushing a lock of hair from his son's forehead. "Not while I was watching," he said. Rowan smiled and closed his eyes. Brisker purred from the corner, content. Darius didn't move. He stayed there for several minutes, listening to the rhythm of sleep, of trust, of peace, but in his mind the maps still shifted, the exit plans still formed, the shadows still moved. Downstairs his laptop blinked, a secure draft, ready for submission to his publisher. Title: The Memory They Tried to Steal. The dedication: just a sentence. To those who disappeared and chose not to stay silent. He closed the file and shut the lid. Outside, the wind rustled the trees along the quiet residential street. A car passed, headlights sweeping across the window before vanishing into the distance. Somewhere, someone might still be watching. But Darius wasn't afraid. He wasn't a soldier anymore. Not a sniper. Not a ghost. He was a father, with the precision of a man who never missed. And that was the kind of target they never learned how to fight. Seconds later, the father's presence alone froze the cabin, the passenger realizing too late that he had provoked the wrong family. Every threat was neutralized before it escalated, and the baby remained safe. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with precision, discipline, and decisive force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, arrogance, and the consequences of underestimating someone with experience and skill. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.